Hi. Well, audiology is concerned with how sound is represented in the human auditory system. But fundamental to that would be a clear understanding of how a sound is produced and the basic aspects of sound. So for our first lecture in acoustics, which is a study of sound, we're going to study how sound is produced. We're going to talk about the different types of sound waves. And we're going to talk about some basic parameters in which different sounds vary in terms of frequency, amplitude, phase. So in clinical audiology, we're interested in seeing how sound is um, misrepresented in an abnormal auditory system. So we're concerned with how sound travels through the auditory system and is and in the normal auditory system and in an abnormal auditory system. Basically, sound can be either defined as a physical or a psychological phenomenon. Psychologically, sound is but an auditory experience. For majority of the sounds that we hear is a byproduct of some disturbance, a physical disturbance in the medium around us. But however, there are cases where there's no physical disturbance or measurable physical disturbance around us, but we still hear sound. A classical example of that would be those patients suffering from this condition known as tinnitus, where they hear a ringing sound, and that's personal. I mean, nobody else hears that, and that's because of some impaired processing within the auditory system. And of course, we know some psychiatric conditions where a person hears voices where there is no physical stimulus around them. And that's a difficult measure. It's difficult to quantify that. Even in the normal system, and of course in the abnormal system. The perceptual experience of sound falls under a sub study of audiology known as psychoacoustics. And we probably will be talking about that a little bit down the road. Physically, sound is but a byproduct of a disturbance that propagates through the medium and reaches our auditory system. Every time an object is being stimulated, a byproduct of that stimulation, the disturbance, is carried by the medium, by a conducive medium, and depending upon the properties of that disturbance, or that what we call a sound, we might hear that. But there's a number of features of the disturbance, of the medium, of the human auditory system that determines how it sounds like to us. But the physical disturbance is relatively easier to measure, and it's objective. We'll be talking a little bit about measuring of sound in a bit. So for sound to be created, there are some essential elements that we need. One, we need a force, an external force, to set an object or a body around us into vibration. And that in turn needs to disturb the particles or the molecules surrounding that object within the medium. And this disturbance needs to be traveling or propagating through this medium to create a sound wave. And this sound wave is heard if its characteristics or its features falls within our relatively limited operating limits of the human auditory system. Thus, the essentials for sound to be created is a vibrator of some sort, and it could be pretty much any object around us, and that object needs to be stimulated, or we need an external force to set that object into vibration. further, we need a medium to carry that vibration that's created by the sound source and the force that sets that body into motion uh, to a distance. And if our human auditory system is in proximity, um, and if that sound falls within our operating limits, we would hear that as a sound. So we're going to be talking about each of these aspects in a little bit more detail, beginning with the sound source, the object. Sound sources are all around us. Pretty much everything that you can see around your room right now is a potential sound source. But of course, the sound it creates, it's going to depend upon the physical properties of that sound, of that object. Pardon me. So sound sources can be like strings, it could be columns of air like in a flute, it could be membranes like a drum, or it could be a windshield. And of course, the most popular sound sources of all is our human vocal folds. So the physical properties of this sound source is going to determine what kind of sound it makes, and intuitively and by our experiences, we kind of expect when we look at a sound, when we look at an object, what potentially sound it can make. Like for instance, when we see a large voluminous object, such as like a drum, we expect that to make a low frequency or a low pitch sound. When we see something like an elastic band or a string, we expect that to make a high pitched sound. So intuitively we know uh, what sounds different objects can potentially make, or what categories of sounds it can potentially make. So mostly the properties of the sound that this object is going to make depends upon the sound source, the physical aspects of the sound source. But it also depends on the force that sets this body into motion. And this force is all around us again. Most of them could be from nature. It could be wind blowing, wind chime, or rustling leaves. Or it could be created, related to humans. It could be like machine produced, or it could be from the human articulatory system, human vocal folds. Traditionally, audiologists have been concerned about how a human produced sounds, especially speech. So we've tried to understand how speech understanding is impaired in individuals with hearing loss. And we have tried to make rehabilitative devices like hearing aids or cochlear implants with technology that restores our ability to hear speech. But of course, we've moved since then, and now we are also interested in seeing how music is perceived, for example, or other nature sounds, and we try to give that ability to those who have suffered with hearing loss. A little bit more about the sound sources around us. There's two fundamental properties of any object that's related to the sound it can potentially make. One's mass and the other is stiffness. Mass is related to the amount of matter within an object. The international standards unit that we use to quantify mass is a kilogram. Stiffness, on the other hand, refers to a body's resistance to deformation when an external force is applied to it. So an object that resists deformation is considered more stiff than an object that has more ply. Now, why is those two properties important for sound? Because these two properties, mass and stiffness, are related to two forces, namely inertial force and restoring force, which is responsible for setting and sustaining any body in vibration. The inertial force is related to the mass of an object, while the restoring force is associated with the stiffness of the object. The restoring force is the force that acts against the displacement of an object. It think about the restoring force as a force that wants to maintain equilibrium. It wants to bring the body back to its state of rest. Okay. So the greater the amount of stiffness, more the restoring force, and more quickly the object would tries to reach back to its resting position. So in turn, the restoring force is proportional to the rate of vibration. Like for example, in piano strings, the force that brings the string back to its midline or state of equilibrium would be the restoring force. So more stiff the string is made, like for example in a guitar where you can increase the stiffness, in turn you're increasing the restoring force and you're increasing the force with which the object tries to go back to its state of equilibrium. So what that does is, when you increase the stiffness, that results in increasing the rate of vibration, and an increase of rate of vibration is heard as a sound with a higher pitch or with a higher frequency. So restoring force is related to stiffness. Greater the stiffness, greater the rate of vibration. Greater the rate of vibration, higher the pitch or the higher the frequency. The other force is inertial force. Inertial force refers to the reluctance of an object to change how it's moving. And it's related to the mass of an object. The greater the mass, greater the inertial force, and greater for the tendency of the object to just do what it was doing. And that could be an object staying at rest or an object being in motion. Now the inertial force is inversely proportional to the rate of vibration. Okay. Larger the mass, larger the inertial force, and slower or reduce the rate of vibration. Okay. An analogy would be planes, airplanes. Larger the airplane, intuitively we know that it needs a longer runway to first take off and for landing, because it takes a larger amount of time, a larger amount of force to change its mode of vibration. In this case, it changes its velocity to slow down. On the other hand, a smaller plane has lesser inertia and it doesn't require a long runway, a short runway would do. So how does it relate to an object? Larger the mass, it's going to have more inertia, so it's going to prefer vibrating in a smaller rate, in a reduced rate. So the larger the mass, reduced rate of vibration, lower the pitch, the sound it's going to make. Okay. On the other hand, smaller the inertia, higher the rate of vibration, higher the pitch the sound is going to make. Okay. So we've got restoring force, inertial force. Restoring force is directly proportional to the rate of vibration. So as the restoring force increases, rate of vibration increases, higher the pitch of the sound. Okay. And this restoring force is related to stiffness. And we've got inertial force, which is inversely related to the rate of vibration. Larger the inertial force, lower the rate of vibration. Okay. So lower the pitch of the sound it makes. And the inertial force is related to the mass of an object. Once an object is set to vibration by an external force, it needs to travel through a medium for it to travel any distance and eventually be heard by an auditory system. A good analogy of a medium would be like the news medium. We've got news medium pretty much refers to any vehicle that brings information to us. And there's a number of news medium around us. We've probably got surface mail, we've got email, we've got texting, we've got television, we've got radio. So probably all of this medium can carry the same information or the same news to you. Yeah, but there might be one difference. Depending upon the medium, um, this news, this information can reach you at different times with different efficiencies. Like for example, if it was a texting or if it could be our ETSU alert system, it's almost instantaneously we get one. Or if one waits for the 7 o'clock news, of course it's going to be a delay. And if one waits for a newspaper, then it's going to be the next day before you hear about that news. Such is the case for the mediums around us with respect to the way in which it can carry sound, the way in which it affects sound. Sound does require a medium. It does not. It cannot travel through vacuum, and that's in contrast to other sound waves like electromagnetic waves. For instance, light. Light can travel through vacuum. Thank God to that, because if not for that, ours would be a dark planet. We wouldn't be getting the light from the sun, and it's going to be perpetually dark on our planet. Unlike that, sound cannot travel through space, and that's probably why we don't hear all the supernova explosions, because we've got this vacuum between all planets, and sound doesn't travel well through vacuum, or it doesn't travel through vacuum. But sound is affected by the different mediums. So if we've got different mediums around us, like gaseous, like air that surrounds us, it could be a fluid medium like water, or it could be a solid medium like railway tracks. Because most of the sound that we are concerned about are airborne, speech traveling through air. When sound travels through air, it kind of travels like concentric circles around us, pretty much like the ripples um, in a pond. So it travels equally in 360 degrees around it. One of the important features that the medium affects the sound is the speed with which it transmits this disturbance. In general, more rarefied the medium is, more thinner the medium is, slower the propagation. That's because for sound to travel, particles needs to disturb each other. So further away the particles are, the longer the time it takes for one particle to disturb another, and so on, before it reaches a particle that's close to the, or in our case, the tympanic membrane at the beginning of our auditory system. An analogy of that would be like dominoes. All of us have stacked and fallen dominoes. You would notice that if these dominoes are kept close to each other, up there, they're stacked closely, and if the first domino is tipped, faster this disturbance is going to propagate along the length of these dominoes. On the other hand, if there is more space between the dominoes, this wave or this disturbance is going to propagate slower. And such is the case with the medium also. So in air, where the particles are more rarefied, there's more distance between air molecules, um, it takes sound, or this disturbance, to travel slower. And so the velocity of sound propagating through air is slower than, for example, in a solid medium where the particles are more condensed or they're close to each other. So now we've got a force that sets a body into oscillation or vibration, and then we've got a conducive medium, let's say, such as air, taking this disturbance from the sound source towards the human auditory system, for example. Well, however, it's still the sound needs to fall within certain limits for us to perceive that as an to have an auditory experience or hear it as a sound. For those who have pets like cats or dogs, you probably noticed that little Frito, suddenly he's got his ears perked up at the middle of night and you're barking his head off when you don't hear anything at all. So that doesn't mean there's no sound in the environment. It's just that that sound probably doesn't fall within our limited auditory system. So when we talk about limitation, there's two dimensions. One is in terms of frequency. There's only a certain frequency range that the human auditory system can listen to. So this frequency range begins for a typical young, normal hearing adult from 20 hertz to all the way to 20,000 hertz. So if a sound falls between this range, we probably would hear that. So, of course, there are sounds below that range and above that range. So below that range, we call that as infrasonic sounds, and above 20,000 hertz, we call it ultra frequency or ultrasonic sounds. Unlike us, there's different animals and different creatures in the animal kingdom that have different ranges of frequency that they best respond to. For example, dogs can hear all the way up to 50,000 hertz. Cats can hear sounds as high as 80 kilohertz or 80,000 hertz. Bats can hear ultra high frequency sounds as high as 120,000 or 120 kilohertz. And all these animals have evolved to best respond to different frequencies depending upon the environment and their needs. For instance, bats use these ultra frequency sounds for echolocation. They bounce these sounds off walls or moving insects to navigate themselves in their environment and identify where food is. They use high frequency sounds because high frequency sounds best are reflected back easily by even small objects in the environment. On the other hand, elephants and whales, they use very low frequency sounds to communicate. Only recently, researchers actually discovered that elephants use low frequency as low as 10 hertz, to communicate with their herd, to kind of communicate where food is or where water is, or if there's danger in the environment. And the reason why they use low frequency sounds is low frequency sounds tend to travel longer distances. You probably would have noticed when you're hearing stereo, it's usually that low frequency bass sound that propagates long distances. You probably might have a noisy neighbor, or you might have a neighbor who blasts his stereo, and you hear that low frequency thud 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 sound from the stereo reaching you. Now, the elephants use those low frequency sounds so they can communicate to hertz that are miles and miles away. And these low frequency sounds can travel around hillocks or trees um, before it dies out and before it's being reflected back. So different animals use different frequencies for different purposes, or they have evolved to use different frequencies for different functions. The human auditory system prefers using this 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, and especially we seem to be sensitive to a small frequency range within this wide 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So that brings us to the second dimension, second limit of sounds that a human audio system responds to. That would be the amplitude of the sound. Okay. So even though we can hear sounds as low as 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz, we seem to be very sensitive to the frequency range between 1000 hertz and 4000 hertz. And what I mean by very sensitive is that we don't require a high amplitude to hear sounds that fall within the 1000 hertz and 4000 hertz. Okay. So while frequencies above and below that range of 1000 to 4000 hertz, we require a larger amplitude before we can even barely hear them. Okay. So when you look at this graph is known as an equal loudness graph. We are plotting how well we hear different frequencies. The x-axis over here from 20 hertz all the way to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. And this green line over here refers to the sound pressure level, which is a measure of amplitude. And in this graph, this green curve refers to the lowest sound pressure level that's required for us to barely hear different frequencies. So in this case, you can see that the curve is lowest for those mid frequencies, for 1000 to 4000 hertz especially, which means that we require very low amplitude before we can hear these frequencies, while we require a lot more amplitude to hear very low frequencies and very high frequencies. So thus we are limited by two ranges, one in terms of frequency and the other in terms of the amplitude of the sound.